everyone, welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Lottie and this is my March statistics and reading wrap up. I am doing this very late in the month of April because I have been lazy and just couldn't be bothered to film it, but I'm finally doing it now. It has been a while since I filmed a video like this, and it's also been a while since I've read the books that I'm going to be talking about today, so I can't really remember everything about them, but you know what, it's fine. We'll try. March has been and gone. We're already into the 4th month of the year. I can't believe how quick it's going. I had a pretty good March. As you guys know, if you've seen my March TBR video, I had a lot of chunky books to read and I did manage to read most of them, so I'm very pleased with myself. Pat on the back to me. So before we talk about the books that I read, let's go through my reading statistics. So in the month of March I read a total of 5 books, which equaled 2,419 pages, which averages out to about 78 pages per day, which is obviously less than I aspire to read. I try and read about 100 pages a day on average, so we are sort of a little bit behind on that in March, but it's fine. I did read chunky books and I also didn't do quite as much reading in March. I think The Sims kind of took over a little bit in March, but that's okay. I also was like watching stuff on Netflix, so I was sort of devoting more time to my other hobbies instead of just reading, so I'm not mad that the number is like less than my sort of monthly goal, but it is something that I would like to try and bring back up in April. For star ratings, I also had a fairly good reading month in March. We only had 1 3-star book, I had 3 4-star books, and I had 1 5-star book as well. A lot of the books that I read were good and great. Very pleased with that. In terms of genre, I read 2 fantasy books, 1 contemporary, 1 sci-fi and 1 horror. For media, 3 of the books that I read were physical books and 2 were mixed media, so I both read physically and listened to the audiobook. Format, I read 4 novels and 1 comic. And finally, for my age ranges, I had a good mixed bag as well, because I read 1 middle grade, 1 young adult and 3 adult books. Statistics are done. Now I will quickly mention that during March I was in the middle of 2 books when the month ended. The first was Silk Fire by Zabia Ellor, which I have since DNF. I DNF'd it in April, but I'll just mention it now to save mentioning it in my April wrap up as well. I go about 20% into this, and this was an e-arc I received from the publisher through NetGalley. I was reading this as a part of a buddy read on Rose's Patreon Discord, and I did attempt it, but a lot of people have DNF'd and I have since decided to DNF as well. There are a lot of problematic things surrounding this book and the author, as well as the fact that I just found the book really boring and really difficult to follow. So I don't recommend it. I just had no desire to continue on with it because it was not a good book, and also because the author has some very controversial things to say. So yeah, that's that one. I was also halfway through City of Glass by Cassandra Clare at the end of March. I have since finished this, but because I was halfway through it, I will be talking about it in my April wrap up, and I haven't included it in my statistics, and the same for Silk Fire as well. I don't include DNFs in my stats, and also yeah, because I hadn't finished this in March, it just slightly carried over into April. I will be talking about this in my April wrap up. Okay, so now that the housekeeping is out of the way, let's get on with the books that I read. So the first book that I read and finished in March was The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice. I rated this 3 stars. I have been reading this series as a part of Vampalong, and this is the 2nd book in the Vampire Chronicles. I actually quite enjoyed it. So I listened to the audiobook alongside reading this as well, and this was the first time I'd listened to the audiobooks for this series, and the audiobooks are really good, and the narrator was excellent for Lestat. So this series continues on from Interview with the Vampire, where a vampire is telling his life story basically to this kid, and he's documenting it all down. And so in this world, that book has been published as a book. And so this is sort of continuing on from what happened at the end of Interview with the Vampire and what's happened as a result of that book being published. And then in this book we are following Lestat, who is one of the main players in Interview with the Vampire, and this is the majority his autobiography, as well as sort of taking place within the world that Anne Rice has created. We start off with him talking about what's going on with his life in the 1980s, and then the majority of the book is his autobiography. The last couple of chapters, I think, are the aftermath of him writing and publishing his autobiography and performing with his band, the Vampire Lestat. It's all kind of a little bit meta and complicated, but I really enjoyed that. I really liked seeing Lestat's life story, and I think he's a really good narrator and like voice within the story itself. It's just this series I find really difficult to get into. The writing is really kind of complex, and I feel like Anne Rice was trying to be really profound with what she was saying a lot of the time, which made it difficult to follow. It's also a really old series that was from the 70s and the 80s, so the writing style was just generally different then anyway. And also about halfway through this book we just get massive monologues from side characters like Marius, for example, which I would try to be interested in, but I just couldn't. I just didn't care about half of the monologues and life stories of all these characters that Lestat meets. Lestat himself is a character that I do really enjoy seeing the perspective of, and I really liked seeing his life from the like mid 1700s up until the present day basically, and I kind of wish we got to see more of his perspective on the events of Interview with the Vampire. We kind of do gloss over that a little bit. This is basically most of it taking up to prior to the events that Louis talks about in Interview with the Vampire. It was really interesting and complex, and also Lestat is queer as fuck. If you can get past the writing style in these books, I think you could enjoy them for what they are, because at the end of the day I feel like they are a romance story. It's just kind of complicated. But I liked learning about more of like what the vampires are, sort of their like biology and where they came from, and about Kasha and Enkil. But overall it was just sort of okay because it was difficult to follow. So because I had read a very chunky, difficult to read book, I really needed something easy, so then I moved on to Boy Queen by George Lester, which I gave 4 stars. I absolutely love this. As you guys probably know, I use the Quarpile system to rate my books, and just because of other nuances with this, it got a 4 star, but if I was to rate it on vibes alone, it would have been like 5 stars. I loved this, and the more I sit on it and the more I'm sort of step away from the story, the more I enjoy it. So this is a young adult contemporary following Robin, who is a young gay man. He's in his final year of 6th form, and he goes out with his friends to a gay bar to celebrate his 18th birthday, and there he sees a drag act. He sees like a full-on drag show, and he absolutely loves it and he wants to give it a go himself. And so we are basically just following the story of Robin becoming a drag queen, and he faces trials and tribulations along the way. He's got a relationship with this guy who is sort of taking advantage of him a little bit and like kind of only using him to hook up. If you've read Heartstopper, it's kind of similar to Charlie's relationship with Ben in that. So it was kind of really difficult to see that side of it. And then also like Robin is dealing with some other stuff. He faces a lot of homophobia from this guy that he's seeing, because his like group of friends are really homophobic and he's like in the closet and stuff. It's all a hot mess, and so Robin is trying to deal with this on his own. He's sort of starting to fall out with his friends as well, and he seeks solace in the world of drag. And this is just a really heartwarming story about coming out and coming of age and queerness and drag, and I absolutely loved it. It was just so much fun. It was so sweet. It made me cry a lot. And also the author is a drag queen himself. Like, it's very much the author's own experience in a way, with like the way he talks about drag. There's also so many great quotes in this as well, and some of the things that the author says about performance art, it just really hit home for me. I used to be a burlesque performer, and I was very inspired by drag in the acts that I created myself. So some of the things that he said about it just really hit home. Also, the author makes a fantastic point about women and trans people in the world of drag, and how drag is not just for cis gay men. Like, anybody can do drag, and I just loved it so much, and it was just such a wonderful story, and I really do think that like everybody should read this book, especially every queer kid out there. Like, it was just so good. I really wish we had copies of this in my library because I'd be recommending it to everybody who came through the door. It was absolutely fantastic, so I really do like recommend picking this one up. So then I read The School for Good and Evil by Saman Chinani, which is a middle grade fantasy. This is the first in a series, and I loved this as well. This was so good. So in this story we are following Sophie and Agatha, who come from Gavaldon, which is kind of like your typical fairy tale village, and every 4 years 2 children are stolen away to the School for Good and Evil. The next round, I guess, of kids is coming up. So Sophie is like set on going to the School for Good. She's like beautiful, perfect. She thinks she's all graceful and lovely, and she does all these things like giving like skincare products to poor people in the village, and she thinks that she's the most perfect princess ever, and she's desperate to go to the School for Good. And she is friends with Agatha, who is kind of like ugly and lives in a graveyard, and like her mom is like the local witch woman who like makes medicines for people in the village, and Sophie's kind of only friends with her because it's like her good deed. The 2 girls do end up getting whisked away to the School for Good and Evil, but Sophie ends up going to the School for Evil and Agatha ends up going to the School for Good, and the 2 girls cannot work out why they are in these 2 schools. They think they should be in the opposite schools. Agatha is basically just desperate to go home, and Sophie is desperate to go to the School for Good. And as you go through the story, you kind of, as a reader, it was obvious to me why they were in each school. I don't know if that's my age, like if a kid, like the target age range would get that, but as you go through the story, Sophie and Agatha themselves realise that they are actually in the right schools for them. This was just so fun. It has all like the magic school vibes that I really loved about a very popular magic school series, except you sort of have that fairy tale twist, and they take classes like beautification and uglification and like how to be a princess, how to be a henchman, things like that, and you get to see them do their classes and stuff while also like trying to get at each other, get home, get to the opposite school. Like, it was just so exciting, and it was such a fantastic story, I think, for kids to read, and I really like would recommend this to kids to read instead of that very popular magic school series. But this one I absolutely love. My only major problem with it is there was a lot of random fat phobia in it, which I didn't really get. At first I thought maybe it was the author sort of emphasising that Sophie is not a nice person and she was being fat phobic because that's just what like horrible people do. But then the people in the School for Good started being fat phobic as well, and saying like you can't be a princess if you're fat and things like that. And I'm still a little bit unsure if the author was doing it on purpose or if the author was doing it to be fat phobic. That was the only thing about this book that really sort of put me off, and I'm still, yeah, like I'm still can't work it out if it's like when you see homophobia in a book but you know that like it's wrong, it's just the author's doing it to prove a point. Whereas like this, I don't know if the author was trying to prove a point or if the author was just being fat phobic. So yeah, I be wary of that going into this book, because it was a little bit jarring how often it kept coming up, and then after about the halfway point it just stopped. So I'm hoping that in the next few books, well in the rest of the series actually, it just doesn't reappear, because it wasn't very nice. So I'm a little bit like unsure about that. But other than that thing, the whole book was great. I loved it. Can't wait to read the next one. I love Sophie and Agatha so much. They are like the perfect like friends to enemies, maybe lovers, we don't know what's going on with that yet, situation. And yeah, it was just so good. So then I read Saga Volume 1 by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. So this is the first in a very adult, very mature comic series set in like space on these warring planets. For a first in a series, there is so much packed into it, and because I just read it like of an evening while the TV was on in the background, I think I'm gonna have to reread it just to get a full-on grasp of the story. But it throws you straight into the deep end with one of the characters literally giving birth. Like the first line basically in this is, am I shitting? It feels like I'm shitting. So yeah, I knew immediately from that first page I was in for a wild ride, and I absolutely love this. So we are following, I can't remember anybody's name, so I do apologise, but we are following these two characters who are from warring species on different planets, and they end up falling in love and having a baby together, and their child is like the narrator, and she is telling this story of these two and what happens to them. So because they're from warring planets, like the mom, she has deserted the army, so like people are trying to hunt her down. There's like mercenaries after them. There's this like race of robot people, which I was a little bit like, what the fuck is going on with these guys? And like the prince of that robot people is like trying to find them as well. Yeah, it was all a little bit crazy, but I was like really into it. Like it's so exciting. Oh yeah, and there's like these ghost people as well, and like one of the ghosts, like she ends up like going with them, and then at the very end they're like on this spaceship trying to escape the planet that the baby was born on. Yeah, it's like there is so much going on in this. It was a little bit like, what the hell is happening? But I was into it and I really enjoyed it, and I would really like to pick up the next book as soon as possible. Kay Gray gifted this to me for my birthday, so thank you so much, Kay. I'm so excited to like dive further into this series and see what it's all about, because this is like, it was insane. I've heard nothing but good things about Saga, so I'm very excited to try the rest of the volumes. I think the authors have just come off hiatus as well, so I'm anticipating more volumes to start coming out soon, so I really need to get a wriggle on because I think there's 9 volumes out already. It was so good and I can't wait to see what happens next. And if I didn't say, I rated it 4 stars. Finally, the last book that I finished in March was Prairie of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. The book that my TBR game trolled me with at the very end. I did manage to finish it, all 800 and something pages. I don't even know where to start with talking about this book. It just was a slog. So I listened to the audiobook while reading this as well to sort of help me along, and I definitely think that if I hadn't listened to the audiobook I would have probably DNF'd this. I just wasn't in the mood for it at the time, and I definitely think not being in the mood for a book affects your enjoyment of it. I did rate it 4 stars. I do think it was a good book. It's just, I feel like it was longer than it needed to be, and if it was going to be this long it may as well have been a duology and not one singular book, because this is a standalone epic fantasy, and I feel like there is so much that you want to talk about when you're creating an epic fantasy world that it is beneficial to try and at least split it into a duology instead of cramming it all into one massive book. I feel like if it was going to be this length it should have been 2 books, and then you could have fleshed out those scenes that kind of fell a little bit short more, or you just take out those scenes that weren't necessarily relevant to make it a little bit shorter. This is the first Samantha Shannon I've ever read. I'm a little bit apprehensive to try her Bone Season series, I think it's called. It is a series I'm interested in reading, but I think that's more like dystopian sci-fi than fantasy, so I definitely think it'll have different vibes to this one. It's kind of hard to talk about what this is about because it's so large and epic, but basically there are 2 kingdoms, the East and the West, and they don't like each other. The West kind of hates dragons and they are like the dragon slayers and they worship the saint, and then the East worships dragons and they kind of like have this group of people that like ride them and they're like protectors or something. And we are following mainly 2 characters, Tani and Iad, I think they were called. So Tani is a dragon rider in the East, and Iad she's basically a chambermaid, is that what the word is, of the Queen in the West. Basically there is a looming threat of this big evil dragon returning, and overall all of the people of this world need to stop this dragon returning because he will end the world. If you've played Skyrim, it's basically like Alduin returning, but 10 times worse. So that's kind of how I could understand it myself, except it's set in this really complex world over 2 continents with about 1,000 characters that you don't have enough time to get to know because it's only 1 book. I did like this. I enjoyed what was going on with Iad in the West much more than anything else in the entire book. Iad is a very, very interesting character, and I really, really enjoyed seeing her perspective and what was going on with her and the Queen. I think I would have wanted that to take more of a centre stage than the main plot itself. The main plot just wasn't that interesting to me, and I feel like it was a little bit like, I've seen that before, you know, it was nothing special. I feel like this is so hyped up in the book community for people who do enjoy epic fantasy, and it just wasn't for me. I feel like maybe as well I'm finding more that I'm not so much of a fan of like high epic fantasy, and I do prefer more like low urban fantasy, kind of more along the lines of like Crescent City or the Mortal Instruments, rather than like stuff like this. I don't know, I feel like the only other major epic fantasy series I've ever really read was like Game of Thrones, of like the same sort of speech, like writing style. So I don't know, I'll see how I get on with other things that I read to like further find out my reading tastes. But yeah, this was sort of like, it was 4 stars, it was good, and I do think it was well written. I just felt like it was too long, too much waffling, and some bits I just like completely glossed over and had no idea what was going on. So my favourite book of March is definitely a toss-up between these two. I kind of can't decide between the two of them. I feel like if I was just going off pure vibes, I would definitely choose Boy Queen. However, I did really, really love the world that was crafted in The School for Good and Evil, and yeah, these were definitely my 2 favourite books of the month. My most disappointing, I'm gonna have to say Prairie. I did obviously enjoy it, I just feel like it wasn't the right time for me to read it. Kind of only read it because it was on my TBR, and yeah, I just feel like it was hyped up so much by the community and it just wasn't really what I was expecting. I don't know. Yeah, I'm kind of glad that I've read it and I don't have to read it again, and I'm like, will I ever reread it? Maybe, but not for a very, very long time. And finally, my most surprising book of March was The Vampire Lestat. This did delightfully surprise me. Like, I didn't love it or anything, but I was very much anticipating to like struggle much more than I did with it and to not enjoy it. Like, I liked Interview with the Vampire, but not enough to want to continue, and it was the live show for the read along that made me want to continue with the series. So this did delightfully surprise me, especially with like how interesting of a character Lestat is, and I definitely think of the 3 that I have now read, this is the strongest one in that first part of the series. But you'll have to wait until May for my April wrap up to see what I thought of The Queen of the Damned. But yeah, this was definitely the most surprising to me in March. So these are all the books that I read in March. Let me know if you have read any of them and what you thought of them, and if you're interested in picking up any of these now that I have spoken about them. So that is it from me today. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video and seeing me talk about all the books that I read in March. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and like I said, let me know in the comments down below if you have read any of these, and also let me know what you read in March. What was your favourite book of the month? If you haven't already and you would like to be, please to consider subscribing to my channel. I try and post a new video every single week. But yeah, that is it from me, so thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you very soon with a new video. Bye!